Sometimes there is a moment where you sit down to play a game that encapsulates one very specific thing you absolutely adore in video games. And for me, that recently happened while I was playing D for the Sega Saturn. Spawned from the mind of Kenji Eno, D or D no Shokutaku portrays the eerie sense of isolation within a hostile environment with the awkward precision of a mid-90s horror game. From the very first step you take in the castle, D presents you with nothing but silence, only to have it interrupted by what I can best describe as a Barry Burton moment.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
As a disembodied head warns you of your impending doom should you proceed forwards to find the answers you came here to seek, after which you're left to your own devices. Your own choice to find your way out, or to let the turn of time take you away from the reality you just departed, leaving you with nothing but ambient silence, a haunting isolation until you turn towards the stairs to venture forth deeper into the castle. There are definitely some aspects of D that can feel outdated, but I can't help but feel there is a method to the slow, meticulous, and precise movements taken in this game. The rooms that you enter feel foreboding, the traps deadly, and it all culminates into this wonderfully weird and surreal experience. Kenji Eno was a rather unique force in designing video games, using his experience as a composer to create some fascinating pieces of video game media, in a sense elevating the way that they could be presented at the time. From creating real sound, Kaze no Regret, a game intended to provide an equal experience for both sighted and blind people, to Enemy Zero, a game relying solely on sound to ensure your survival. He often manages to blend the different methods of delivery to create incredibly surreal experiences that felt like something more. Games became something that Kenji Eno was strongly fascinated by at a very early age, being influenced by early arcade games, particularly Space Invaders and Pac-Man. Taking his fascination for video games alongside his love for programming and making music, he entered his first developed game, a Todokawa Murder Case, into a competition and actually managed to place. After dropping out of high school at age of 17, he would, after several failed placements at Canon, break into the video game industry as a co-planner, composer, and supervisor at Interlink, helping with the development of the Ultra series, among other things. However, unsatisfied with his position at Interlink, he would leave the company and found his own studio, EIM, or Entertainment Imagination and Magnificence, which operated as a contract company which mostly worked on sequels. Feeling constrained by the limitation of this type of work, he disbanded the company in 1992, after which he founded Warp, the studio responsible for the body of work that would form his legacy. The small team of developers that comprised Warp would later become powerhouses in their respective industry fields. Notable is Fumito Ueda, responsible for Shadow of the Colossus Echo and Last Guardian. And with the Warp team at his back, Eno would start working on the hauntingly fascinating D. Originally published by Panasonic for the 3DO in 1995, D later got ported to the Sega Saturn, PlayStation, and PC. And while I'm primarily covering the Saturn port, the 3DO version is an excellent example of the eccentricity and the unorthodox approaches to game design that Kenji Eno presented. Having the Japanese release of the 3DO version being presented in a box that doubles as a puzzle, giving players access to different codes, hints, and tricks to complete the game. Though not mandatory for the overall experience of the game, it gives a good look into Eno's approach to game design, generally presenting the medium with a more tactile feel to bridge the gap between the game and the player. And while the Saturn version that I played didn't come with a puzzle to solve, it did give me a fascinating experience, as I solved the in-game puzzles, nearly got impaled on a wall, and went into a quick-time event fight against an animated suit of armor. D can be extremely silly, however, despite all the odd deliveries, plot revelations, and goofy scares, it's when the game gets quiet it starts to come alive in this eerie sense of foreboding and dread that only a game from this era can deliver. It's here where Eno's strength in audio comes to the foreground, and you truly get a sense that you're alone in this weird alternate reality, with only a few hours left to find your way out, before the space you now inhabit collapses into nothing. The quiet late night of downtown Los Angeles gets disturbed by a hostage situation unfolding at the hospital, where the director has shut himself in alongside former patients, now victims, leaving the police unable to resolve the situation, eventually reaching a boiling point in a violent act of mass murder before disappearing. The story of Dee revolves around Laura Harris, who receives a call about the incident, shocked that her usually gentle and caring father, Richter Harris, is capable of such violence. She travels from San Francisco to Los Angeles to find out what pushed her father over the edge. Arriving late at night at the hospital, she walks through the automatic sliding doors to be met with a grueling scene. The hall and corridors are riddled with the bodies of her father's victims. Whether the slow pace of the scene is intentional or not, there is a definite sense of foreshadowing to the game's overall depiction of isolating dread, with Laura's footsteps echoing through the silent night and every sound effect cutting through the silence of the game like a hot knife through butter. Following the trail of corpses, Laura finds herself face to face with a ripple in the fabrication of reality that swallows her up and transports her to a new dimension more reminiscent of a medieval castle, finding herself standing in a dining hall with the table plated. As she explores the room, the floating disembodied head of her father appears, warning her to leave the castle. She doesn't want to vanish with it. This is also the first moment where Dee shows its colors as a mid-90s video game with voice acting.
This is your father. Laura, go back. You must not cross over to this side. This is another world born of my own mind.
From this point on, you're left to explore the castle, finding clues about what happened to your father and where you are along the way. As the mystery slowly unfurls itself, you also start to find these beetles that seem to give Laura visions of a gruesome murder scene at the dining table you found at the start of the game. There is some neat symbolism spread through these visions that help you put together what is actually happening, like the bugs having the same shape as the necklace of the victim. One of my favorite earlier moments in D is when you spring a trap trying to reach a corridor leading to the library. The spikes suddenly jut out of the wall, and the wall itself starts to rapidly scrape its way to Laura, stopping right before it would otherwise puncture her eye, and the spikes retract back to their original position. What's cool is that while you haven't solved the puzzle, Laura will be reluctant to go near the point where the trap was sprung, and it gives a game where you can die a surprising amount of tension as well as a more human touch. It helps with making Laura feel like the fragile, reluctant protagonist lost in a hostile environment, all accompanied by the same looming echoes of Laura's footsteps reverberating through the castle, serving as a constant reminder that while you're searching for answers, you do so alone. And from here, the game leads you through a library with the subtlety of a boulder rolling down the stairs into a room where the paintings really like to smile. And after a bit of tinkering with the puzzles and another message from Daddy Dearest, we're off to the second disc. On the 3DO release of the game, each of the game's 4 sections was divided into 4 discs. The Saturn version, however, crams the entirety of the game's FMV goodness into 2. With the entry into the circular chamber, we also enter the second disc of the game, leaving you to turn the wheel in order to find the right room, leading to a free astrology lesson, a fencing class that Laura involuntarily gets involved in, and a suitcase whose retrieval seems to be somewhat complicated by large spikes coming out of the floor. Solving this room to get to the top of the tower is both the most fascinating as well as the most tedious part of the game. Again, feeling like the general slowness of movement in the entirety of the game is something intentional to create that urgency against the ever-ticking clock. However, the rotating room in and of itself isn't very intuitive. It takes a good amount of time to get the animation of the rotation started, and it often takes 3 to 5 turns to get to your goal, which comes in the shape of a room-sized stained glass design, revealing the first real peek behind the curtain of the cause of your current predicament, with an emaciated figure being depicted with slightly longer than usual canines. Laura, not being the most appreciative of stained glass art, pulls out a gun to break the window and climb to the top of the tower, where she finds a door which leads to a small narrow corridor. With time running out, her father's head appears to her once more. And here we finally get some answers. Richter's sudden turn to extreme violence wasn't something that came completely out of nowhere. The Harris family is plagued by the blood of Dracula, causing members of their bloodline to change from kind people to murdering psychopaths due to their vampiric ancestry, taking turns at being the host for the spirit of Dracula. With it now being Richter's turn, he had created a pocket dimension resembling a castle from that time to assure that his daughter would not come to harm. The growing influence prompted her father to isolate himself in the alternate reality to prevent Laura from becoming part of Dracula, keeping her as far away as possible. Failing to do so meant that there was a good chance that Laura would be taken by the host of Dracula, making the monstrous entity complete again. This motivation is only furthered by the context of the visions Laura had when interacting with the insects throughout the game. In these visions, we see a violent murder happening with a woman being stabbed to death at the dinner table. The revelation later comes to Laura when she regains her memories at the end of the corridor, where she receives flashes of memories that were sealed away by her father, in which it's shown that Dracula's influence had already started to overtake Laura, resulting in her mother being violently murdered, dismembered, and subsequently partially eaten by her. The same woman as the one depicted in the visions from earlier in the game. There is something oddly chilling about the way that one of the final locations just ends in a dead end. Especially after the revelation Laura just experienced. Almost as if the castle itself is offering her a choice to just let time pass and this dimension fade from existence with her in it. An idea that, while I may be reading far too much into it, helps put emphasis on that time restriction. Solving a final puzzle leads to one of the coolest stairs of mid-90s video game design, with at the top a painting of Laura's mother. From here, we're transported to the final room and final choice of the game, to free Dracula or to escape from the castle, with either decision leading to a different ending of the game. And for as odd as the voice bits feel alongside the stiff animations of 1995 FMV cutscenes, especially compared to more modern standards, it's the silence in which the game conveys most of the narrative and atmosphere. The castle itself feels like a deeply personal journey through both the descending madness of Laura's father as well as her own repressed trauma of killing and eating her mother. It's impressive in a lot of ways, but also feels kinda lonely. Traversing the massive castle generally only gets the silence broken by your own footsteps and the occasional visits of floating ghost dad head, giving the entirety of the game an eerie sense of isolation that meshes extremely well with the deliberately slow pace of everything, often directly juxtaposing the time limit of 2 hours to finish the game from start to finish. Laura gets portrayed as this frail and frightened being in a strange land far away, that while she wants to find the answers to what changed her father, she does so reluctantly. Giving her little animations of not wanting to go places where she knows danger resides was a brilliant touch to convey her fear, giving Dee an overall sensation of being a deeply personal story for the characters themselves, which at times does somewhat get lost with the presentation of the narrative. Dee crosses the boundary between first-person survival horror game and an interactive movie, with its primary gameplay elements consisting of navigating the hostile corridors of the castle in first-person view and interacting with the environments through itself in the various puzzles the game throws your way. Following a similar structure akin to Myst, you have to roam the castle figuring out what piece goes where in order to progress deeper into the castle itself, such as searching a drawer in an upstairs study to find a key, which in turn leads to a puzzle box, which then gives you a ring to open a door to the library. The rest of the game plays out with great looking FMVs to accompany a more traditional point and click style of puzzle solving. A button to open a menu to pop up the menu to select the item you need to interact and move around. What's missing, however, is a pause button. One of the leading strengths in enhancing the overall vibe of the game is the sense of urgency that stems from the time limit the player has to complete the game. D has a maximum runtime of 2 hours, where if you fail to escape, Laura will be left to the alternate dimension. Combining that with the inability to pause the game adds quite a bit of pressure behind solving the puzzles. As there is no real way to die, the only option to have a fail state for the player is to introduce a limit which is constantly enforced. Whether you're slowly turning the wheel of a rotating tower or exploring for secrets, there is this ever-looming presence in the background that gives you a constant sense of urgency or accept the fate that Laura will not be able to escape. For as fascinating as D is, the game doesn't quite withstand the test of time that some of its contemporaries managed to uphold. One of the biggest problems being the voice acting, that by modern standards is hilarious and holds a lot of the same energy as the flat deliveries in the original Resident Evil. And while I'm all for that, I'm afraid it detracts from the beautifully tense and lonely vibe that the game is going for, placing the horror that D intends to portray in direct juxtaposition with the unintentional comedic value of the narrative. Depicting scenes of extreme violence and even some insinuated cannibalism only to be followed up by
Laura. Laura.
where the voice acting kind of fails to deliver the narrative in any other tone than Briscoe's lament in Michigan Report from Hell. The general atmosphere of D remains incredibly dense, in large due to the expertly implemented sound design. The reverberations of Laura's heels through the empty hallways, mixed with the slow and haunting ways that the game tries to scare, make the castle feel like so much more than just a haunted house tour. For as short as it is, the puzzles and pacing feel just right, and the real-time time limit greatly contributes to the pressure you feel when trying to solve the castle's riddles. The multiple endings also allow you to discover the narrative at your own leisure, adding a little replay value to a game that, when you take away the having to solve the puzzle part, feels much more like an exploration than a puzzle game. It's a wondrous little time capsule that over the years has developed a cult following of its own. Many of the works that Kenji Eno would later produce followed a similar path, gathering a modest success at the time, but kind of falling short of commercial success upon release, at least internationally. With the 3DO release of D being reviewed the most favorable, the other ports would be received with mixed receptions. However, Eno's lasting appeal is mostly found in the way that the man managed to shake the industry with everything he produced. The themes that D presents were considered somewhat of a taboo at the time, with most games steering clear of the depiction of extreme violence. Despite that, Eno would break the mold for games and allowed horror to flow more freely and creatively through the industry. Frankly, the dude was kind of a rock star, forcing Sega to donate Saturns to the visually impaired if they wanted exclusive contracts for his games, as well as constantly shifting the barriers with the way he used sound to his advantage, making entire games revolve around invisible enemies that could only be found using the Saturn stereo output, and creating a radio drama-made video game with real sound. Sadly, Kenji Eno passed away in 2013 at the age of 42 due to heart failure, leaving behind an incredibly fascinating legacy of work that would be appreciated and enjoyed for years to come. D's lasting appeal stems from the bizarre and unique way that it's presented, and if you can embrace the aesthetic of 90s video game voice performances, it's definitely something to get lost in.